There are people that say there are two Noam Chomskys, as you know, the linguist and the political activist. Which one of those do you prefer?
Well, I can't really say. If the world would go away, I would be very happy to keep to what's called my professional work, linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and so on, which I do find exciting, exhilarating, challenging, and demanding, and easily could easily put my full-time activities into it. On the other hand, the other activities in their own way are difficult, rewarding, complicated, also challenging, and necessary.
Again, if you've just joined us, our guest for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes is Noam Chomsky, who is now located at MIT. How long have you been there?
Almost 50 years.
What year did you go there and why?
I went there in 1955, and actually at that time I had been at Harvard for 4 years in a graduate fellowship and had just gotten a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually hadn't been for 4 years. I had no recognized academic field. The work that I was doing didn't fit anywhere. It didn't have any academic home, and I had no particular expectations of going on into an academic career, because for one thing, there didn't seem to be any possibilities. But I did receive an invitation from MIT to be in the electronics lab. I don't know a tape recorder from a telephone practically, and I know nothing about electronics, but I was the electronics lab at the time was directed by Jerry Wiesner, later became Kennedy's science advisor, who was a very imaginative person. The laboratory itself was a mixture of all kinds of exciting activities. A good deal of MIT at that time was in a transition from being primarily an engineering school to becoming primarily, in fact, totally a science-based university. It's a 10-year transition, which had a lot to do with things happening in American science and technology and so on. And the electronics lab where I was the center of a lot of these activities. Biology, neurophysiology, mathematics, linguistics, acoustics, just on and on. Many of these were experimental efforts. It wasn't at all clear that they were going to go anywhere. Some of them succeeded very well, others failed, but it was a great ferment of intellectual excitement and interaction and challenge. There were other places like it at the same time, for example, Bell Laboratories. And as I was primarily in the electronics lab in a research position, but I also was asked to do some teaching. I was able to teach introductory linguistics and philosophy courses, the first ones in these areas that had been taught there, but mainly my service to the university was teaching cram courses in French and German to graduate students who in those days had to pass a reading exam in French and German, which they considered a total waste of time because they knew they were never going to look at anything. And there was a technique for sort of getting them through the exam, essentially teaching them to fake their way through the exam, and that's the courses I was teaching for a couple of years.
On the screen is some shots of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is on the Charles River, right across from Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. How many students there, do you know?
I think there's roughly, last time I looked, it was about 4,000 undergraduates, and I think about maybe twice that many graduate students, something roughly on that order.
My background on you says that you have published 65 political books and 33 linguistic books from a total of 60 different publishers. We have been doing book shows here for many, many years. I've never heard of anybody publishing 98 books.
Well, a lot of those books are collections of talks, interviews. If you looked at the ones I actually sat down and wrote, it wouldn't come to anything like that.
What was your first?
First book? The first book was called Syntactic Structures, and that was actually not intended for publication. It was notes for an undergraduate linguistics course at MIT, which at that time this material was basically unpublishable. It did not belong in any recognized field. I had submitted a couple of articles to journals which were returned. I'd submitted a book for publication, and it was MIT Press. Was returned with the sensible comment that this didn't seem to belong anywhere, and I ought to wait until the field exists before trying to submit a book, which was not an unreasonable comment. It did come out 20 years later. By then, the field had been established. The first Syntactic Structures was actually notes, which a Dutch publisher who visited saw sitting on my desk and asked if I would put it together and let them publish it as a monograph, and they did.
What was your first political book?
First political book was American Power and the New Mandarins, which was a collection of essays, came out in 1969. It's just been reprinted. It was essays and talk, mostly a lot of them based on talks through the 1960s. Starting around 1963, I became pretty much involved in Vietnam War issues, and was giving many talks, usually to audiences of 2 or 3 people. There was absolutely no interest at the time. But over the years it built up, and by the late 60s there were way more invitations and opportunities than I could take up. I was also directly involved in activism and resistance. I have to say, for years, every time I came to Washington, the first thought that came to mind was the smell of tear gas. It was in and out of demonstrations, in and out of jail a number of times. The essays were a collection of, in the book, were a collection of talks, commentary, discussions based on these activities.
I have on my lap here a Norman Mailer book called The Armies of the Night, and up at the top is a picture of you back in 1967. What were you doing there at the Pentagon?
That was a big demonstration at the Pentagon in, I suppose it was October 1967. One of the first large-scale national demonstrations, not the first, but one of the biggest on a national level. Actually, Miller and I ended up in adjacent cots in a detention center somewhere after we were arrested.
Over the years, lots of controversy, lots of books. We're going to go to the phones in about 10 minutes, and they'll have a chance to deal with these. But the other book that I have in my lap, and I've got a lot of your books, is one, it's a small one. It's called 9/11, and it was a bestseller. What's your main point in this book about 9/11?
Well, that book is a collection of interviews. It's a sample of interviews, and it happens to be just those that happen to be electronically stored. So, for example, it doesn't include interviews on BBC and so on. Right after 9/11, there was a massive requests from the United States and around the world for discussion of the events, their background, what they meant, what they were going to lead to, and this is a slightly edited collection of a number of those interviews. The point was, if there is a single point, that we should be aware of the role that we play in the world. What happened on 9/11 is a horrifying atrocity. It's probably the worst single act of large-scale terror that's ever taken place. I don't think there's another single case where thousands of people were killed in one act. On the other hand, for much of the world, the response to 9/11 was welcome to the club.